Hello, everybody. Welcome to Torn Tuesday, your weekly dose of all things Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, books, movies, games, and of course, Amazon's billion-dollar series. I'm your co host, Justin, and Cliff is backstage getting our special guests ready in a few minutes. So before we get to the topic at hand, and I'll explain why the title looks intriguing, I guess is the right word. But first, everybody always wants to know what is the latest going on with Amazon's Lord of the Rings. Well, let's go to it. All right. The entire production looks like has moved to Queenstown, New Zealand. Right there along the water, there is one of the main actors that we're really excited about, Maxim Baldry, posting pictures of the waters near Queenstown. And a lot of fans are really excited about the geography of that area. So, look, if you know anyone that lives in that area, Lord of the Rings will be there for the next few weeks. So please tell your friends to mosey on around, go for walks in the park. Make sure you go for walks high up on the hillside. And, all your cameras, all your phones have long lenses on your camera, right? I looking at the chat, wonderful to see a lot of our regulars, and it's even more wonderful to see some of our wonderful ringers announce that they are finally getting the vaccine. This is amazing. We're almost there. New Zealand has done it better than anybody. So congrats to New Zealand, and congrats to you, Kay, and everybody else getting their vaccines going. The other big news, besides the production moving to Queenstown, is that they are still in Auckland. They've still rented all of the biggest sound stages in Auckland. So it sounds like that they're going to, whatever they were filming in Auckland, they're going to scrub those sets. They're going to be building new ones in Auckland while they're filming out in the waters of Milford Sound. And then when they're done there, they'll move back to the sound stages. So should be all systems go. All systems go. Look, one of the reasons they announced that Amazon was going to film two seasons in a row is kind of to save budget and save resources. Look, for instance, if you film, let's say there's a scene in episode 3 of season 1 that is at Edoras. And then there's a scene, that's not going to be true, right? But let's just say it. And then there's a scene in season 2, episode 8, that needs that same set. It makes sense to film both those scenes at the same time, and then you can dismantle the set. Rather than build the set, film the one scene, then go on to 10 other episodes, and then come back to that set. So the whole point is the whole point of doing 2 seasons at once is that they can build the one set and then film everything that needs to be at that one set for the first 2 seasons. So that's what's going on. It's very smart filmmaking. Speaking of Amazon filmmaking, Fellowship of Fans is reporting that Amazon has officially hired a woman to direct 2 episodes, possibly more. And again, J.A. Bayona has only directed the first 2 episodes. So there are 18 other episodes to direct. And according to Fellowship of Fans, they've hired an unnamed woman to direct the 2 of the mid-season episodes. So this is really exciting. If you recall, watching the appendices special features of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, you'll know that Fran and Philippa did take turns directing some units. Again, the production for Peter Jackson was so big. Everyone got a chance at directing. Rick Porras, who was a co-producer, ended up being a 2nd, 3rd, or 5th unit director. Everybody wore different hats on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, but Fran and Philip each had their moments. And in fact, all of the great character building scenes of Smeagol and Gollum were directed by women. So there is great precedent for unrivaled storytelling and with so much empathy and emotion that Fran and Philippa brought to the table in the script and then in the director's chair. People in the chat asking, do we have a name for the new director? No, we don't have any names yet. We don't have any names. There are 18 episodes supposedly being directed by people, and right now we only have this one rumor from Fellowship of Fans that one of those directors that will be directing 2 of the 18 episodes will be an unnamed woman. So talk about, we're grasping at straws here. Speaking of grasping at straws, yesterday we reported that that the huge Tolkien artist Ted Naismith had been engaged on Amazon. He went on our Facebook page and corrected the record, saying, "I'm deeply touched, but unfortunately this announcement is 100% invented out of thin air. No one from Amazon has approached me, full stop." So he wanted an apology. Ted Naismith, we apologize. I apologize. I'll take the heat. I posted that because I am hearing that Ted's artwork is in the offices, the production offices of Lord of the Rings, and his artwork is in the craft workshops that are building the sets and designing the environments at all of the production vendors that are actually doing the building. So, if we go back in time, you could see Ralph Bakshi's artwork in the halls of Weta. And a lot of stuff was inspired by Ralph Bakshi's work on Lord of the Rings. So it looks like we might have a similar situation now where Ted Naismith's work is influencing Amazon's $1 billion Lord of the Rings series. If this is true, I hope that Amazon recognizes the value that Ted brings to the table. I hope that Amazon recognizes the instant positive outpouring of support that we saw on Facebook and Twitter of fans elated that he would be involved in the show. And I hope that Amazon and the showrunners recognize that if you have such a beloved artist that fans trust, that does great work, that has played in the Second Age and First Age, and why wouldn't you hire him? Why wouldn't you hire him? Amazon is the richest company in the history of the world. Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the history of the world. But Jeff Bezos has personally said budget is no issue. So what is preventing Amazon from engaging Ted and giving us some stuff? So Ted, we got it wrong. We hope that they call you up. We hope that they call you up. But the big topic today, and we have a great discussion ahead of us, is Moriarty from Ain't It Cool News, whose real name is Drew McWeeny. That's really his name. I think we've seen his driver's license at some point. Drew McWeeny used to be known as Moriarty at Ain't It Cool. He scooped a lot of things during the Peter Jackson era. He posted this weekend this huge article celebrating the 20th anniversary of Fellowship of the Ring, which came out this year, 20 years ago. So this article, and I highly recommend after this show, you go read this article and then you go pick up the books of the authors that are going to be on the show. So Peter Jackson's original 2-movie Lord of the Rings look like. So in this article on Polygon.com, Drew McWeeny talks about what the scripts were like for 2 movies. He talks about what Peter Jackson was trying to do. He was trying to play the game. Peter was just, a hungry filmmaker, and he would do whatever it takes to make Lord of the Rings. And so when they went from 3 movies to 2 movies, Peter made adjustments. And then at some point, Harvey Weinstein said, not 2 movies, 1 movie. That's all I can afford. So that's what instigated this, because a lot of Twitter discussion was like, man, this Harvey Weinstein sounds like a bad guy. Well, it turns out he is a bad guy. I think he's in jail right now because he really is a bad guy who committed criminal offenses and federal crimes. And I think we're going to get into that conversation now because based on this article, we reached out to a couple authors that have written the definitive books on the topic. In fact, this article from Drew McWeeny and Polygon actually uses information from the book by author Ian Nathan about Peter Jackson. It's kind of the most official biography that has been published so far on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. And Ian Nathan, the author, worked with him. So we're going to bring him on in a second. They're just about ready. And then Kristin Thompson wrote the FRODO franchise, which is a deep dive in all the numbers. So we're gonna explore everything. And I just want to say, I think this is it for Harvey Weinstein. I just wanted to say, we're going to get this out of the way, right? Like, there's going to be a lot of articles this year in 2021, celebrating the 20th anniversary of Fellowship of the Ring and the success that it had. There's going to be a lot of articles that have to talk about Harvey Weinstein because he was part of this. And remember, Harvey Weinstein is credited on the Hobbit movie as well, and we'll get into that in this conversation. But as far as the One Ring and the fans and everyone here, I just want to say this isn't a topic I want to revisit. Okay? This article came out this week. Harvey Weinstein is a major topic of this article. There was a lot of commentary on it. So we brought two of the world's leading experts on the topic of Harvey Weinstein, Peter Jackson, and Lord of the Rings to set the record straight, let everybody know what this is about, and so we can move on to bigger and brighter things. So I hope this is going to be a great conversation. So you know what? Let me see. Cliff, are you ready over there?
Let's talk about this. Yes, we're going to talk about all the good things, all the good stuffs about development of scripts and the early stages of development of The Lord of the Rings and some of the more interesting key players who were moving around on a very weird chessboard at the time. And we're going to wind the clock back to 1998, and we'll talk about some of the things in the late 90s that were happening with Peter Jackson's career and everything leading up to an incredible nexus of opportunity and chance and talent. So let me bring on our wonderful guests, the author of Peter Jackson and the Making of Middle-earth, Anything You Can Imagine. The name of the book, Anything You Can Imagine, and it is by Mr. Ian Nathan, and here he is joining us all the way from across the pond. Welcome, Ian, to our show. And we also have author of the FRODO franchise, a wonderful book and a very familiar face to us here at theonering.net, a friend and companion on this journey for a very, very long time. It is author Kristin Thompson. Welcome to our show, everybody. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Hello, everybody. Now, let's get started. Where do we begin? Do we begin by talking about the splatter films and the zombie films? Do we begin by talking about the heavenly creatures? Where do we start this barometric reading of the room where a huge fantasy story ended up taking over what King Kong was going to be on the roster of what Peter Jackson was doing? Where do we begin? Let's start.
Okay. Well, I think one place that's good to begin would be Heavenly Creatures, because that was what gave Peter his in at Miramax ultimately and linked him up with Miramax for quite some time before he ended up at New Line.
Absolutely,
right.
Yeah. I think you could, if you want to take it right back, you can probably go to Peter Jackson's childhood. And obviously the King Kong obsession was there, but he loved Ray Harryhausen, his wonderful stop motion fantasy films. And they were always in the back of his head as something he wanted to kind of replicate and do. So the idea of doing a fantasy film, whatever shape or form it might take, was sort of planted in his brain when he was a child, and it's always lurking there. You're absolutely right. Heavenly Creatures is the film that brought him to Miramax. It's what created that relationship, his deal with Harvey Weinstein. I think it's probably one thing I would like to say just up front, and for everyone, it's at this point in time, Harvey was still a major movie producer in Hollywood. It was a big figure. The terrible stories that then broke weren't particularly known at this time, and certainly weren't known by Peter Jackson, the people who worked with him. So all of that came subsequently, and the stuff that occurred at the time, was done just in terms of Hollywood and the deals they were making.
There are many infamous stories of Harvey Weinstein, and there's been documentaries about him and the way he took care of filmmakers and the way he scorned filmmakers and actors. There is a documentary called Overnight, which is the making of the Boondock Saints. And basically, it's a fascinating story on the trappings of Hollywood and the power Harvey Weinstein actually held in Hollywood, where he could just pluck someone out of obscurity, that showed their quality and showed their talent, and put them on national stage, the world stage, and make them a major player in Hollywood. That is what he thought his role was with Peter Jackson. He thought he was working with some independent New Zealand actor, and he was giving Peter his big break. And when Lord of the Rings came around, he thought, what, I'm going to make Peter Jackson a star. That was his perspective. Is that accurate, Ian?
Oh, very much so. That was the kind of MO of Miramax, and certainly the point in time when he took on board Jackson. He just had a huge hit with The English Patient, which was a very literary adaptation, and quite at the timing, the Oscars were going to happen for him. So the idea of Miramax itself, as far as Harvey was concerned, was going up market. It was creating classy films on a kind of world scale. They weren't the indie company anymore. And I think he saw Jackson and Heavenly Creatures as, a classic, new style Miramax film. It was a strong story. It was literary in the way it was put together. It was made in New Zealand, and there was a growing reputation about New Zealand filmmakers. And I think he felt Jackson was something he could invest in and portray. And they got an Oscar nomination for Heavenly Creatures for the screenplay. So automatically that goes to Harvey. Well, he's my little darling. He's something I'm going to nurse through and turn into a superstar. But within that, there's something sinister. It's Harvey's show. He's like an old Hollywood mogul. I am the man pulling the strings.
Well, we also have a pretty big article that just appeared on Polygon a day or two ago, and it was written by a writer famous to internet nerds, and his name was Moriarty on Ain't It Cool, Once Upon a Time, and now Drew McWeeny is writing for Polygon and a few other places, and he wrote an article called What Peter Jackson's Original 2-Movie Version of LOTR Almost Looked Like. And getting into the weeds of these details, the discussion talks about the relationships between these players on the field, but some of the details seem to have been perhaps overlooked, or perhaps some of the key players, like Mark Ordesky, was not mentioned in this article, who has been a friend of ours and a guest on the OneRing.net for many, many years. Kristin, can you tell us about the key moment that happened when Peter and Fran were trying to create a fantasy film, and then they realized they are drawn back constantly to Tolkien's influence and Tolkien's efforts? At that point, the effort couldn't have gone anywhere without researching who had the rights. Is it true, perhaps in your estimate, that the weird layout of the rights issues was one of the big things that impeded the efforts of everyone?
Oh yeah, there's no doubt that the rights issue is very complicated and indeed a stumbling block. And Ken Kamens, who was Peter's and Fran's agent at the time was the one in charge of figuring out where those rights lay. And he quite soon figured out that they lay with Saul Zaentz, who had become, basically, he owed a favor to Harvey Weinstein and Miramax for having financed The English Patient when 20th Century Fox had pulled the plug on it. So once they found out that Zaentz had the rights, the idea was that Harvey Weinstein already had this relationship with Zaentz, and he was owed a favor. So he went to Zaentz and spent a great deal of time negotiating because Zaentz was still reluctant to give up the rights. But ultimately, Harvey Weinstein did sign the rights for The Lord of the Rings. But the problem was that they had hoped to do The Hobbit first and then do Lord of the Rings. And the distribution rights for The Hobbit remained with Zaentz. And it's not clear why, but he only had the production rights. And it's no good to produce a film if you can't distribute it. So
Why is that weird? But we're looking at Saul Zaentz in terms of that's the man who worked with United Artists and Ralph Bakshi and created that 1978 version of The Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah, exactly,
and
exactly.
The animated Hobbit from Rankin and Bass was also through that earlier deal with Saul Zaentz. Is that correct?
Yes, that's all correct. And ultimately, the initial Bakshi version of Lord of the Rings was so unsuccessful that he never made the second half, which had been planned initially. So he was not exactly fond of The Lord of the Rings at that point. He had lost money, and he was not keen on having other people go ahead and make other versions on the assumption that they would fail as well, I suppose. So that's why it took so long to get these rights out of Zaentz, even though he did owe Harvey Weinstein a favor. But that finally happened.
Wait, so you're telling me that Saul Zaentz, who got the rights from Tolkien himself, was obsessed with the financials of the success of it, and he didn't want it to succeed. He was scared that it wouldn't succeed, or like this is 20 years after those cartoons.
Well, it is 20 years after, but Saul Zaentz presumably might have had other issues with Harvey Weinstein as a result of having worked with him on The English Patient. So there may have been some grudges there. We can't read his mind, and he's gone now. He didn't get the rights directly from Tolkien. United Artists bought the rights from Tolkien, and Zaentz got them from United Artists. So that's a little extra complication in there. But we'll never know ultimately why Zaentz was so reluctant.
And to be clear, for modern fans, Saul Zaentz is still in the game, and they're still at the table with Amazon. He, after the success of Lord of the Rings, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, they renamed the company from Saul Zaentz to Middle Earth Enterprises.
I think that happened earlier. I'm not sure when that happened, but he also owned all the trademarks for anything mentioned in Lord of the Rings. He considered he had a trademark on. He really was this guy who controlled Lord of the Rings after UA gave it up to him, and he got all the trademarks directly from the estate. So he was making money off Lord of the Rings through licensing and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah.
Right.
So Ian, Harvey Weinstein, huge, successful at the Oscars, successful at the box office, relationship with Peter, relationship with Saul Zaentz. He's got all the pieces there. So he goes to Saul Zaentz and he finally makes the deal. But there isn't a deal for a number of movies. He just wants the rights to The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and he's gonna figure it out later.
Well, it's like all Hollywood stories. It's much, much more complicated than that. Inevitably. Just to backtrack a little bit, the Hobbit problem was to do with MGM, and MGM had bought United Artists along the way during a terrible time for United Artists. And within the kind of thicket of deal making there, for some reason during the whole Saul Zaentz and the animated thing, MGM were going to distribute it, and they got distribution rights to The Hobbit that they never lost and never relinquished, and that's what caused all the problems down the line for The Hobbit. Anyway, that's a whole other story. What kind of happened with Harvey's, as you were saying, it took so long to get this deal sorted with Zantz. And you've got to remember, lawyers were involved. Lawyers know how to prevaricate and earn money, and the whole thing kept circling round, and everyone argued about costs. And Zantz
I love that word, prevaricate. That's a good word.
That's the word lawyers use. It describes them. And obviously, still, Zantz was as clever a maneuverer as Harvey was, and they had come into some kind of not conflict, but tension on the English patient, which had all ended up very well. But this took 8 months to resolve. And Peter Jackson needed work. You know, he was just a guy who needed to compete, and he made the Frighteners in the meantime. He had this deal with Harvey, but Harvey said, okay, go away and make the Frighteners. And developed a relationship with Robert Zemeckis, and that's how the Frighteners came about. And they started to develop Weta Digital, and that became this kind of company for Jackson that he needed to feed and supply, to bring in workers from LA to do his special effects, and he needed to keep going. And one of the reasons that he and Fran decided to think about even doing a fantasy film was to help Weta Digital. So we got to use this company, we're growing. How about doing a fantasy film? This is sort of anecdote they tell. They were sort of chatting over breakfast one morning, and Jack said, let's do a fantasy film, and let's do it with Weta. We can do the special effects. And Fran said, okay, what do you got in mind? And he kept saying things, and she goes, well, that's like Lord of the Rings. And he kept saying some more, and she went, well, that's also like Lord of the Rings. He got so annoyed and said, why don't we do Lord of the Rings then? And she said, well, that sounds like a good idea. I think, again, there's probably a lot more to that. So that idea had been put to Harvey, who they had a first look deal with, and that's how the whole thing with Zantz started. But Harvey was taking too long, so Jackson needed work, and he was going to do a Planet of the Apes film. He was in talks with Fox about. Ken Kamins was doing a lot of the deal making in the background, and there was a King Kong offer that was put to him. He's in the background of the Frighteners, and it was a much different film to the one he eventually made. And at this point, Peter said, I want to do King Kong. It's my heart's desire. I'm going to do King Kong. So he relinquished Planet of the Apes, and he said to Harvey, look, we're going to delay Lord of the Rings. I'm going to do King Kong first. I need to keep Weta Digital going. I need to sort of do I want to do this film for myself. Harvey went ballistic. He screamed at him down the phone, you are in business with me. You can't do this to me. Probably the language I imagine was quite colorful. And Peter, he's a Kiwi. He's a very reasonable guy. He's not used to those kind of high-powered furies that come with Harvey. And he got it full blast. He was just on the phone. And Jackson was quite just knocked back by this, staggered by the kind of response of Harvey's fury. But he got thinking. He said, he and Fran thought, well, why don't I go to Universal and say, why don't you make it a co-production with Miramax, King Kong? So he called Harvey back and said, let's do a co-production of King Kong. And it gets even more complicated. As part of that deal, Harvey got Shakespeare in Love. This is how Hollywood works, deals within deals within deals. So that also happened as part of this. And Peter Jackson likes to say, I was responsible for giving Harvey Shakespeare in Love. But the net result of all this is that Harvey is placated for now, thinks he's got half of King Kong. King Kong then falls apart, the first iteration. Frighteners doesn't do very well at the box office. Mighty Joe Young is coming out with Disney. Universal get cold feet, call up Jackson or call up Ken Kamins and say, no more King Kong.
Do you know how many people have completely forgotten that Mighty Joe Young was a thing? And it actually did have an impact on Universal's feelings about the marketplace. I suppose the analogy could also be made to the Dungeons and Dragons feature film with Jeremy Irons, because New Line Cinema, New Line also wanted to get that film out of the way so that it would not interfere with their future plans to release the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That's, there's so many variables at play. That's wild. Please continue. I'm sorry to interject.
No, absolutely. So you got to see this, and months are going past. This is all the while negotiations are going on with Saul Zantz and Lord of the Rings. This is all going on in the background. But Jackson needs work. In fact, interestingly, one of the things he did just to keep going and keep the money coming into Weta was he did the black hole effects in Contact, the wormhole effects. He acted as effects supervisor for Robert Zemeckis, just as a job. Just that one sequence in Contact is the work of Peter Jackson. You ever watch it again?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, I learned something
doesn't
new
just-
every day. I'm a
does-
big Zemeckis fan, and of course, I'm an even bigger fan of the late John Hurt. And I just love that movie. It's an extraordinary film. I did not know
Yeah.
that segment was farmed out to the technicians at Weta Digital. I did
Yeah.
not know.
And literally,
Wow.
Jackson served as the guy on the ground, as the kind of producer of that sequence. So that's his one little role as an effects supervisor is on the contact. He doesn't get a credit, but he was the man on the ground doing it.
Wild.
So that guy, King Kong falls apart. He's promoting The Frighteners in the UK at the time, has to fly back to Wellington, tell all of Weta, it's all falling apart again. Lord of the Rings has collapsed, King Kong's collapsed, there's no Planet of the Apes. Things are really bleak. And that's when he calls Harvey again and says, well, King Kong's fallen over. And Harvey is furious again. But this time he's furious at Universal on behalf of Peter. This is the way Harvey works. 1 minute you are the enemy. The next minute, I'm going to save you, Peter. Universal, they've kind of messed us around. Don't you worry. Lord of the Rings is going to happen and we're going to do it together. Forget Universal, forget all that stuff. So he reignites the hope in New Zealand and in Jackson that Rings will happen. And that's just at the point where the rights come through. So it's almost sort of serendipity. And Ken Kamens, he's a great guy. He talks a lot about fate playing its part in the whole kind of turn of events. Every so often, these little small things happen. Fate plays its part. And as Harvey, acting as the big guy, the big savior, said, well, at that point, now we can do Lord of the Rings. Let's go ahead and do Lord of the Rings.
So Harvey gets the deal done with Saul Zaentz. Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are Harvey's finally, and he can do with it. Miramax is a successful production company, but Miramax becomes a subsidiary of Disney. Disney acquires Miramax in the wake of some of the Oscar wins, I believe, and so now Harvey has to get budgets approved by Disney executives. So he goes, he takes the Lord of the Rings scripts. It's funny, we did a reunion when quarantine first started about a year ago now, all by Zoom, and Richard Taylor and Mark, I believe, were telling us a story of like lugging, these pitch packages of like giant things, and then the glue came off on the flight. It just it felt like a pop-up book that they had made to go pitch Disney and Miramax executives of like, here's what we want to build. But over the course of several months or a year or so, Disney went from let's skip The Hobbit, let's do Lord of the Rings, let's do a trilogy, let's do 2 movies, and then they said let's do 1 movie.
Well, I think you have to jump back a bit on that, because they did 18 months of pre-production with Miramax, and it was just Harvey. He said 2 films. He said $75 million, which was a sort of standard ceiling for them. And it was only after these 18 months of pre-production that Harvey goes to Bill Roth and asks for more money, because it's obvious from the 2 scripts that this film is going to cost a lot more than $75 million. Joe Roth sends him to Michael Eisner, who's the head of Disney. And Eisner says, not only are you not going to get $135,000, you're going to make 1 film and you're going to tops 75 million. So they were well into this project by the time this happens, that Eisner makes this rather foolish decision to get rid of Lord of the Rings, even after he had already given up Rush Hour and Elf, both of which were Miramax projects put into turnaround and made by New Line. So this was the 3rd time this happened.
What?
It's pretty amazing.
Can I just jump in there a bit? As far as I know, you're absolutely right about the 75 million ceiling. And Disney had bought Miramax in 97, I think they bought them. So they were sort of, as this deal making was made, Disney were always in the background. And this is a Ken Kamen story to me, was that Harvey wouldn't let Michael Eisner in on the deal. Eisner said to Kamens afterwards, said, I was interested. I wanted to have a look. I wanted to read the scripts. We could have got involved. We could have backed up Miramax, because Disney had the power and the money to do so. but it's pride with Harvey. You know, this was his big project. This was his next English Patient, his big literary adaptation. He didn't want Michael Eisner and Disney to have a share of the glory, even though they technically owned Miramax. He still had the power to produce it on his own. The problem is, as it became clear, as they started to finance what was, you know, the plan of the two films, it was going to cost way more than Harvey could afford. That was the central problem. Harvey could only really go to 75 million, and Jackson was going, I need 120 million to make the two films. Yeah, and all of the, Harvey bought into the vision. It was the cost that was the problem. And Harvey didn't want to go cap in hand to Eisner and say, give me the rest. And so he got angry. He got upset by the situation. He said, well, you betrayed me, Peter. You were going to make this for 75 million. He didn't want to lose face in front of everyone. That's kind of was fundamental. And he'd already put 12 million development into the project. You know, so he was already out of money with nothing to show for it. So this is where the fury start to build.
Well, that's my question. So 18 months of pre-production, $12 million into pre-production to pay the salaries of Weta to keep doing the work and things like that. Is that just 100% Harvey's money? Like he's literally spending his own money to make it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's Miramax money, I suppose. You know, in the grand scheme of what finances and who finances who, it comes down the Disney tree. But it's Harvey's development money he has given to Jackson. And you know, if you're going to give him any due in this whole process, he did do that. He did finance the development of the project at the beginning. He did get the rights, and he did put them to Jackson, and he did start the wheels turning. That's when Alan Lee and John Howe came involved. They sort of developed all the special effects. All that beginning part happened on Harvey's dollar. So that certainly happened at that point. The problem was they just hit this hitch where actually Harvey sent down various executive producers, including a guy called Marty Katz, who was very influential at the beginning, to really cost up what it was going to get on the ground and cost it all. And they went through it, and Marty Katz said, this is a brilliant project. This is astonishing what they're doing, but it's going to cost $120 million to make two films.
And to kind of set the context, and maybe Kristin, you have some insight into this, is that, you know, we're talking about Harvey Weinstein 20, 30 years later right now. But at the time, Harvey Weinstein was known as a supporter of creatives. I mean, he was winning Oscars, he was funding successful movies, and he was known to support creative people that he liked. I mean, this isn't like an overbearing studio exec. You know, that has all the wrong ideas. Like, you know, as we're hearing it, he still had that reputation at the time, didn't he, Kristin?
Well, he had people like Quentin Tarantino that he was supporting, and of course Tarantino still supports him. But you know, he also had the nickname Scissor-Handed Harry of Harvey, because he would buy films, a lot of Hong Kong films, for example, and either put them on the shelf or cut them. So he had that reputation too by that point. So it's kind of a mixture.
All right, so let's fast forward. Basically, Harvey spent his own money. At the end of the day, Michael Eisner says, you're getting one movie and take it or leave it. Harvey says, we're leaving it. Harvey tells Peter, you can go shop it to someone else. Go ahead.
He was going to go ahead and make it as one movie. He wanted to make it as one movie. He wanted, rather than give it up altogether, you know, given that choice. It was Peter that insisted through Ken Kamens on putting it in turnaround, and Harvey was very reluctant to do that. But he went ahead and he put these very, very draconian measures attached to it, which was partly that all the money had to be paid back, the 12 million plus 2 million he had spent on buying New Zealand currency. And they would have to write him a check on the very day they signed to take over the picture. And he only had 4. So it was a real hill to climb for Peter and for Ken Kamens.
Well, and I think Mark Ordesky, the executive producer, told us the story when we did a big reunion in a couple years ago when we celebrated the first shooting day of Lord of the Rings 20 years later. So we got all the department heads together right there at Scum and Villainy Cantina, and Mark said he had the most onerous terms, but the New Line guys were totally sold on the amazing script and Richard's displays. Like, they were totally sold. So they cut that check, and it was the biggest check in New Line history at one time. Like it's one of the biggest single payments, he said. But back to Harvey. So he negotiated, like, he demanded, like, he needs all his money back, and he needs that executive producer credit. But what we found out, and I don't know if this is touched on in your book or if this started happening after, but we found out in recent years, due to federal lawsuits from Ashley Judd and Miro Sorvino, that Harvey told Peter and the casting agents to intentionally do not cast those two women, and that's very illegal.
Yeah. To backtrack, obviously Harvey, during the development process, they were getting as far as talking about casting, because that always comes up with Harvey. It's the thing Harvey gets most obsessed about. He doesn't care if you sit there talking about special effects, he'll just phase out. And there's these various meetings that happen at Miramax headquarters. I think there were 3 of them in what's called the sweatbox. There's this room at Miramax. It's got kind of glass windows where all the poor directors are brought in. And Harvey and Bob were doing this together, would berate these poor guys. They sort of batter them into submission. And Jackson and Fran went through this 3 times. So there were these discussions. And Jackson always said, Bob never got it. He didn't understand what Lord of the Rings was. He kept thinking it was Guns of Navarone, Men on a Mission movie. And Jackson was like, no, he never understood. You know, Harvey had read the book, Bob hadn't. So you're always going uphill against people who just don't understand what the material is. But you're right, there were discussions about casting at the time. Obviously, they weren't yet in a state where they had a green light. You know, they were still debating the budget and all those things, whether it was 1 or 2 films, that was all going on. So they weren't literally casting at this stage, but there were discussions. And obviously those stories came out subsequently that Harvey had put parameters around certain people, that the names had come up for roles, and Harvey had obviously knocked them back and said, not those people. But it's not quite the case that they were about to be cast, and he stopped them being cast because film hadn't been budgeted, it hadn't been green lit, so there was nobody being cast. I think there was discussion about Morgan Freeman as Gandalf at one point. All these things were going through, you know, the processes, but it was very much debate at that stage at Miramax, because what had happened, finally, they'd reached an impasse, and this document had been produced behind Peter Jackson's back, in which way they were going to shrink down 2 films into 1. I got hold of this document, Peter gave it to me. And just shows you what they were going to do. They were going to cut. One of Rohan and Gondor had to go. Battles had to go. They couldn't have Saruman and another character. Half of it was just going to get chopped. That was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back in a way, this document that just got delivered to Jackson, saying, this is how you're going to do it. This is how you're going to cut it all. And Jackson actually sent copies to all the department heads going, this is what it is. This is what we're up against. And then Jackson went back to New York with Fran and said, I'm sorry, Harvey, we can't do this. The fans will never forgive us for this. It's our reputation as much as it's yours at stake. Mm-hmm. This is the wrong thing to do. And they were sort of imploring him on a creative level, I think, don't you do it. And Harvey went, you are doing it, or I'm going to get John Madden to direct it, who just directed Shakespeare in Love for him, and Hussein Amini, who'd been a screenwriter, who I know, and he got a copy of the script. You know, so this process was going on. Ken came and put up a rumor that he'd talked to Quentin Tarantino about directing it. I'm not sure how realistic that was. I don't think Quentin really would be that interested. It might have just been a threat that Harvey was throwing out there. So that's what Peter, Kristin was saying, that's what Peter walked away from. He just said, we can't do it. We have to let it go. We're going to go back to New Zealand, make New Zealand films, and so be it. And they kind of left this sweatbox, and Harvey's screaming at them. And Peter said he was literally shaking. He went to see a friend of his called David Lind, actually one of the first people to find him. He used to work for Miramax. He worked in a company around the corner then. And he got there, and David Lind, he said, you are ashen, Peter. And he gave him a whiskey to steady his nerves. And Jack said it's the first time he'd ever drunk scotch in his life. Was coming out of that meeting. And given this drink by David Lind, this fellow producer, just to calm down. And just to get, everything that Peter does, the rationality he applies to life, was just exploded by the fury of Harvey. He just couldn't believe what he'd gone through.
So, Kristin, what was this idea like? So Harvey created kind of a blacklist of like, don't even consider these actresses. Was that normal operating procedure for Hollywood at the time? Was Harvey known for blacklisting people?
I don't think, as Ian said, it's illegal. So no, I don't think it was standard practice at all. I don't know to what extent he was actually doing it. But I'd like to get back to what Cliff said about the fact that Moriarty doesn't mention Mark Ordesky, because this is the point at which Mark steps in. He had known Peter for about 10 years. He had been working with him on that Nightmare at Elm Street script that never got made. And he was the one who really ushered through the pitch session to New Line, which is where you leave Miramax and go to New Line. Supposedly Ken Kamen, according to Ian's book, sort of delayed their meeting with New Line because he was trying to give the impression there were other studios interested, but there were no other viable studios interested. And in the meantime, Peter's making this 35-minute pitch film, a VHS video, which he took in his famous meeting with Shea, and Ordesky was there. And Moriarty never mentions this, but he really sort of oversaw this project. And later on, when the film was being made, Ordesky was the one who was sort of protecting Peter. He was the one going back and forth, and requests from Peter and requests from New Line. And he managed to protect Peter a lot and get things done his way, basically. But he was very, very important in the pitch session. And Moriarty also says that the decision by New Line to take the film was based on reading the two scripts, but I don't think that's at all the case. I don't think they read the scripts before they signed. This pitch film is really quite a remarkably convincing little ad for doing The Lord of the Rings as it had been developed during those 18 months of pre-production. They had lots of stuff. They had costumes, they had maquettes. He filmed himself being very confident about this film. He did little clips using sketches and local actors to present just little excerpts from the scripts. But basically, he didn't talk much about the scripts at all. And he didn't mention whether he was planning on one film or two. He certainly wasn't hoping even for 3. I mean, that would have been beyond his wildest dreams. But that's what Shea said. Bob Shea said, why don't you make it as 3 films? It's 3 books. And that pitch film really, I think, convinced him, because before they left that room, Shea was saying to Peter, don't sell this to another studio until you've heard from us. And of course, they had no option to do that, but the New Line people didn't know that. So I don't think the 2 scripts were probably read until later on. And even then, Mark Ordesky doesn't seem to think that other people, very many other people in New Line were interested in reading the 2 scripts. They knew that those were not going to be the 2 scripts they were doing. They were going to be doing a 3-script version, which would be pretty much started from scratch. So when the New Line deal was done and they cut a big check to Harvey for all of those costs he paid for himself, is he out of the picture then? Like, this is your money, walk away. Like he's no longer involved in anything. That's pretty much right. Yeah, I mean, he was insisted on being executive producer, but that's pretty standard in Hollywood. The idea that the Weinsteins are credited on in the Lord of the Rings films at the end is pretty much standard practice for anybody who has some kind of major role to play. They didn't produce the film in the sense that Barry Osborne produced the film. He was down there, overseeing day-to-day activities. But the Weinsteins had gotten the rights, which probably nobody else could have done. And they did set the film into development, and a lot of that material was used in the final films. So, it's not surprising that they would get executive producer credits.
Yeah, I think that was part of the deal was, and also they got a back end as well. They got a financial cut or Lord of the Rings, as part of walking away. So there was, in a sense, the relationship between the pre-production era and the input then, and the fact they were financial partners on some level. And that was all part of the Harvey's draconian deal making at the end. He said, well, if you're going to do it, this is our deal. Harvey never expected Peter to make a deal, because he thought Peter would come back cap in hand and make one film for him, and Harvey would get one.
Right.
He never expected the New Line thing to happen. In fact, the two heroes here are Mark Ordesky, as you say, and Ken Kamins. Ken Kamins is astonishing, because he spoke to Peter after the whole terrible confrontation with Harvey. And Peter said, we've given up. We don't want to do it. We're going to make New Zealand. We don't want to do any of this Hollywood business anymore. Really deflated, shattered. They've been through too much. King Kong, Planet of the Apes, Lord of the Rings twice, falling over. He just had enough. And Ken came and said, okay, but he didn't say no. He put the call in to Harvey and said, let me cut a deal. Let me try to go elsewhere. So it was he who talked down Harvey and said, I'll get you your 12 million back. At least you owe this to Peter. Let me set it up. And of course, the only place you could set it up in the end was with Mark and with the New Line. And that's kind of finally what happened. But Ken Kamins is an astonishing figure. I mean, he tells a story of during the whole terrible Harvey days that he was at the hospital and his wife was giving birth and his cell rang, and it's Harvey Weinstein shouting at him about something. Some part of the deal, some part of the money. And he said, Harvey, I'm at the hospital with my wife. And in fact, Harvey did send some kind of gift to him. But that's what you've got with Harvey. And I think in many ways, Ken Kamins is the guy who just stood between Harvey and Peter for a lot of it. And he's the guy who kept it going. Even when Peter had given up, Ken is the guy who sort of drove it forward. And then Mark stepped in and got the deal at New Line. So it's, there are kind of individual people who just got it over the line.
Were there any considerations, ramifications, rights issues of New Line using creative that was developed under Harvey Weinstein's Miramax?
No, that would have
been
part of the
all
deal. That was part of the deal. They were buying all that stuff by paying Harvey back for it.
I am surprised at all of the things that I thought I knew, and I'm learning so much more. With thanks to your erudition, both of you. It's really wonderful to have you join us here. I can imagine, psychologically speaking, just in terms, not business, not talking about money or legal rights, but in terms of the personalities at play, I can only imagine that Peter and Fran wanted to get as far away from the obvious ugliness and the toxicity that was coming from Weinstein as a person. And they were probably thinking to themselves, after the ugliness of King Kong and the turnaround of Rings and everything, they were probably thinking, let's just isolate ourselves back in New Zealand again and never work with these horrible, horrible people ever again. It's kind of remarkable that anything got made at all, really. Can I ask either of you, Ian, Kristin, have either of you seen that VHS tape?
Yeah.
That special? Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have seen it. Yeah, it's great. As you were saying, it's like one of the kind of the DVDs that come with the extras that come with the DVDs. It has that kind of quality to it. That enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Peter looks frighteningly young in it. And you're like, this was a long time ago. But there's lovely little details, as Kristin was saying, that over the animatics, they have people reading the parts. And Craig Parker, who played Haldir later in the film, plays Frodo in the VHS. So if you have a great trivia night, you can say which two roles in the whole scheme of things did Craig Parker play? And you can say, well, he played Frodo and he only did the voice, but for that little thing, because he was local.
Wild. Do you know how many times I've sat down for an interview with Craig and he never told me that?
He never told you that, I think.
Wild.
Let me ask you this then. Like, the Lord of the Rings rights have always been complicated, decades and decades. All the way back to the Beatles trying to get them. Kristin, can you speak to, because they are so complicated and they were wrapped up between you at United Artists, MGM, Saul Zaentz, does it take a person like Harvey Weinstein, an extremely powerful, just alpha personality, to get this done?
Well, I can't really speak to that because I don't know what he did to Saul Zaentz to finally convince him. Probably gave him, you know, a lot of, well, Zaentz got part of the profits of the film as well. So, but
Mhm.
I would like to think that Weinstein's reputation is not shared by too many other producers, but there certainly have been producers in history who were not only hitting on their actresses, but pretty temperamental. Louis B. Mayer is one example going back into film history. So it's, yeah, a lot of nasty stuff goes on in Hollywood.
Well, I have worked with one of the biggest producers in town, and his name is Tom DeSanto. And people know him specifically from the X-Men films and from the Transformers films. And he got to work with us at the OneRing.net to make our feature documentary film, Ringer's Lord of the Fans. And I can tell you, not every executive producer is cut from the same cloth. You could not ask for a more soft-spoken, polite, and deeply, deeply wise and well-behaved person. I'm glad to say that there are some examples that set the standard so it's easier to point out the rotten apples in the barrel, for sure.
Well, let me ask you this then. Harvey already had a reputation in 1998-9. How was there any blowback from fans, from culture, from the press of his involvement in Tolkien's works? Like, did Harvey's reputation negatively affect the project in the eyes of fans?
Not at all, because Miramax never announced that they were making the film. It was only when New Line announced it that became public.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, Harvey's name, before all the ugly sexual misconduct scandals, Harvey's name in Hollywood was also tainted because of the perceived shenanigans around the Best Picture win for Shakespeare in Love. And there were a lot of perceived shenanigans that maybe were not perceived, maybe they were real, because Shakespeare in Love was considered by many the least deserving of the Best Picture nominees that year. And yet, because of the wild, over the top, extravagant efforts of Harvey, he had pushed and probably did some underhanded cajoling with a lot of Academy voters to get that film where it got for Best Picture. So yeah, I can appreciate a lot of the negativity that was around Harvey's name at the time before we found out the even worse behaviors and scandals that came out later. I feel bad. I really feel bad for Fran and Walsh and Philippa and Peter, and to have to get in bed and deal with people who are that awful. And you're right, like you said just a few moments ago. Thank God for Ken Kamens and Mark Ordesky for helping to mitigate some of those difficulties. Otherwise, the negotiations may never have ever happened at all whatsoever. Do you think that without Mark, that maybe Bob Shaye would never have thought about expanding to a 3-film version of the series? Is that possible to conjecture that maybe?
I don't know. I think Mark is very important in getting Peter through the door and being his right-hand man, because they were obviously friends. You know, Peter used to stay on his sofa when he came to LA and he was a young filmmaker. Yeah. So they really had a strong bond. Mark was one of their keys. But there was a New Line story as well. I mean, New Line were having real trouble at this point in history with getting franchises going. You know, they had trouble with talent costs and things like The Mask. They couldn't get a sequel to The Mask going, and you know, Elm Street wasn't working for them. So they needed, as Bob said at the time, they needed sequels. They needed something that guaranteed them sequels. It was a business, you know, that they were in a slightly more commercial place than perhaps Miramax were as a company. And they would, Bob was developing a trilogy around Foundation, the Asimov novels, and that had all started to fall through at the time. So at the point Peter walks in the door with Lord of the Rings, this astonishing pitch, Bob actually needed something with guaranteed sequels. So there's a lovely fairy tale about Bob, you know, being this great benefactor who came and said, "Don't do 2 films, do 3 films. There are 3 books." All of that's true. And he was a romantic. Yeah, he's a much more romantic figure than Harvey. But at the same time, he was a Hollywood producer who ran a studio, a small studio, and he needed to make money. So what was behind his decision was, this guy's just walked in the door with the most famous book of the 20th century, 2 sequels guaranteed, put it on my desk with an astonishing pitch. Yeah, there was a lot of risk involved, an awful lot of money. Peter still was not yet known as a blockbuster maker. There was a huge gamble involved in New Line, but there was also great wisdom in choosing to do it. And they could see the future. So you've got to give Bob his due, you know, Bob Shea, who was difficult to work with in his own way down the line, but not like Harvey. But you know, he was motivated by the fact that he saw this as a commercial possibility. And it was, you know, he saw the future, you know, there in front of him on this VHS tape, or this kind of this fantastic little video they put together, all the maquettes they handed around in the room, they got to handle. Bob could see it. And he said he saw 2 sequels, not 1. So he was a businessman, and it was a good business decision.
Well, that's show business. That's a good pitch, great story, great script, and the business side. Yeah, this is the business we want: sequels and franchises. But this is not the end of the Harvey Weinstein effect on Middle Earth, because let's fast forward 10 years. The Hobbit is ready to go, and New Line has been, for all purposes, dissolved. Warner Brothers is now making The Hobbit. Warner Brothers has to make a deal with MGM to clean up the last bit of rights that were not cleaned up earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
But the first film, An Unexpected Journey, Harvey Weinstein has an executive producer credit. Can someone explain that? Like, did he have anything to do with it?
Well, he got the rights, the production rights from Saul Zaentz. Remember, it's only the distribution rights that went to MGM. The production rights were with Zaentz. And so Harvey still got something for them. That's what executive producer credits are for, things like that.
So
it's a way to have your name carried over on a piece of paper. When you write that piece of paper and say, future sequels, future iterations of this will include my name, even though that person has no direct involvement at all.
And to be clear, when we say will include my name, include my paycheck on the back of the success of that film. The interesting thing is there were lawsuits with the 2 Hobbit sequels from Harvey Weinstein and Warner Brothers. Ian, do you have any insight into that?
I think it's simply as Kristin was saying, there was this incredible legacy that goes right back to Saul Zaentz and right back to United Artists, this long entangled contractual rights involving The Hobbit. And when Harvey got involved, he did get the rights to produce a version of The Hobbit, but couldn't get the rights to distribute it, so gave up on it, but still held on to those production rights. And in the deal with New Line, that carried over. And so whatever happened with Lord of the Rings also happened with The Hobbit. It was just a legacy of lawyers and contracts. So when The Hobbit finally arrived, and New Line was now very much only part of Warner Brothers was confronted by this problem that if they produced The Hobbit, they have to produce it not only with MGM, but give a cut to Harvey Weinstein because it's in the contract, going all the way back. And they did not like this at all. He had to do nothing for this project, nothing at all. I mean, he might argue that he did the initial negotiations with Zaentz, and that gives him something, but really he had nothing to do with The Hobbit in any practical way. But he had a cut of the end. And there's a story that, remember when Lee Daniels made The Butler, that film about the White House, and they couldn't call it just The Butler because there was some copyright issue with a film with Warner Brothers. It was an age-old problem, really, I think. So Warner said, okay, we'll give you the rights to just call it The Butler, which we own, it's copyright. But you're going to have to give us back the money on The Hobbit to do that, is what Warner said to them. And Harvey went, and I'm not doing that. So that's why it's called Lee Daniels, The Butler, because they couldn't legally call it just The Butler. It's just the ongoing feud between Warner and Harvey over whatever amount of money. And obviously Warner were paying hundreds of $millions to make The Hobbit. And Harvey was taking 5% of the net, something at the back end, and laughing because he had no risk in the game at all.
My goodness, the Lord of the Rings, the movies have touched so many other franchises and Oscar winners and everything. But staying with The Hobbit and Harvey Weinstein, this is all from lawsuits. You can go to the court records and stuff like that. Check this out. Warner Brothers argued that the 2 Hobbit sequels, Desolation of Smaug, Battle of Five Armies, were mostly about the dwarves, and according to them, Harvey's rights stopped when the movies about the Hobbit stopped being about Bilbo. And so
I've never heard this either.
This
I've
is
never
all in
heard
court records. So they intentionally, the studios, Warner Brothers intentionally told Peter, Fran, and Philippa to rewrite the sequels to The Hobbit to make it more about the dwarves and less about Bilbo, and give him less and less screen time, so they could challenge Harvey Weinstein's rights to the sequels and not pay him. And if you go look at the credits,
is that really true?
Sequels, I don't believe Harvey's name is as prominent as they were. So we can thank Harvey Weinstein for the incredible deviation from the books.
Oh my gosh. Is that true? I can't. Okay. Because one of the number one criticisms levied by even casual fans notice when they're watching the Hobbit trilogy that suddenly we're spending hours with Gandalf and Thorin and Thranduil and everybody else, even a new character cut from whole cloth, Tauriel, and we're spending a lot less time with Bilbo. Oh my gosh.
So that is a direct response to the lawsuit that was already in action during the production of the sequels of The Hobbit. And this isn't conjecture. I mean, these are legal arguments made in a court of law. So this is, Harvey felt that, if it's called The Hobbit, he gets points. He gets money from The Hobbit. And Warner Brothers felt, no, your rights stop. And it was down to like a single sentence in the Saul Zaentz contract, which says, films based around the character Bilbo Baggins. So, based
wow.
is so it was a novel argument, so again, the Frodo franchise delves into the franchise aspects of this whole thing, and so Kristin, thinking about Harvey Weinstein and what everyone knows about him now, and him going to jail, and like, he did illegal things, and his reputation should be tarnished. But is it appropriate for fans to just ignore the influence Harvey Weinstein had, or do you think did he have in some ways a role to play to kick this whole thing off in a positive way?
Well, he is the man who got the rights from Zaentz. That is a fundamental thing that, without that, they couldn't have gone on. I mean, you could argue that maybe somebody else could have convinced Zaentz to lease them the rights, but as it happened, it was Weinstein that did it, and there's no denying that he was a key figure at one point in the process.
Is there any historical precedent to erasing an executive producer's name off a movie?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think. They've gone back in time. I'm not sure they have, because it's a legal issue.
Yeah.
You can't deny history, whatever subsequently happened. You can't go back and rewrite it from before, because if there are legal involved, and credits are contractual things. Your name on the credits is a legally binding element that says my participation in this film, whatever it is. So if you take it off, you're actually making a legal thing rather than a creative thing. I'm sure these wizards that work for the studios, these legal wizards who can find the tiniest detail in contracts and make it a whole case, might be able to find a way. But I think it's enormously difficult to do, because then you might argue, can we erase Harvey's name from every single Miramax film ever made? Because obviously his legacy doesn't just go on the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits. It crosses right back across Tarantino's films and The English Patient, all those films he made, and he was very successful in his day. So it becomes a very big issue. I don't know. There may be a precedent for it. I'm not sure whether there is.
It sounds like the caliber and the quality of work is that we got from Peter and Weta is it has a lot to do with the early support of Harvey Weinstein. I mean, like the dude committed $12 million on a movie that wasn't even greenlit. Like that is a lot of salaries to pay. That is a lot of work, 18 months of work, and as many artisans on the belief of Harvey Weinstein that this is a game-changing project that needs to be put to screen. So it is, sometimes it takes that bullish figure to really like get something going, and then the strength of the financial strength of New Line to commit to buying him out and stuff like that. One of the other things that is conjecture right now is that Amazon paid $250 million to clean up the rights for their $1 billion TV series. One of the reasons that it costs so much, and I think that might have been a record of rights acquisition. I mean, just $250 million just for the rights was in part to buy Harvey out of anything that he might feel entitled to. So,
or Saul Zentz.
Well, I don't know about the rights, because I don't think Harvey ever had the television rights. And you can argue those are not really films, they're television series.
Those are different.
Yeah.
Tolkien never sold the television rights. They stayed with the estate. He only ever sold the film rights to United Artists. So he retained the television rights. Didn't think anything of it, because obviously he wouldn't. But that sat with the Tolkien estate, obviously, as they grew in power. So a lot of the costs of the Amazon deal was literally right at the coalface of the Tolkien estate, and what remained with them, what they could get.
Oh, so no Amazon dollars are going to Harvey at all?
As far as I know, they're not. I don't know whether some terrible lawyers are trying to find a reason for it, but there are kind of complexities about what Warner have the rights to, and Warner had to be brought on board as a partner in the whole deal with Amazon, because they have rights to certain elements of it, certain characteristics. Warner still have the right to make a sequel to Lord of the Rings. They can do it if they want to. They can make one up and use the ingredients, because that was all part of the original deal that Tolkien sold. So if Warner so chose one day to go, why not? Let's make Lord of the Rings 2, another trilogy involving whatever happens 1,000 years later. They're fit to do. I don't think they will at this stage, but you can never say never in Hollywood. But those rights remain. So what actually Amazon were buying that's why they had to go back. It's very odd. I mean, Chris, you may know more about this. They've sort of bought the rights to the appendices, and they've gone into the appendices and sort of conjectured from the appendices, because they haven't got the rights to the Silmarillion, because that remains with the estate. And of course, that was published after Tolkien's death, so that never went into the UA deal. So all these things sort of focused what Amazon can possibly do, with creatively with the Tolkien's world.
Yeah, totally. Well,
excuse me for interjecting. I took a moment to put my Blu-ray, my new 4K ultra high def Blu-ray of the Desolation of Smaug, and I'm looking at the end credits here. Screenplay by Fran, Philippa, Peter, and Guillermo del Toro. And then right after the screenplay credit, based on the novel by J.R.R. Tolkien, right after that, the producers, Carolyn Cunningham, Zane Weiner, Fran Walsh. Now, the executive producers here do not list Weinstein. It's only Ken Kamins and Carolyn Blackwood. So his name was taken off of the second and third Hobbit films. And then we go straight to the late, great Andrew Lesney. Wow, it is true. It happened.
Yeah, this is all in the court of law. So his ultimate, I think his ultimate legacy, hardcore fans will treat negatively because they changed the scripts. They changed Tolkien's story in an effort to exclude Harvey out of the Hobbit sequels, and it worked legally. And we'll always debate whether the quality of those films are up to Tolkien or whatever. But look, it's the 20th anniversary of the release of Fellowship of the Ring, and as we wrap up this conversation about Harvey, what is Harvey's ultimate legacy with Lord of the Rings, and how should fans deal with his legacy? I mean, is it always going to be a stain, or should fans kind of reconsider, like he had his role to play in the story and it was somewhat a positive role? Like how should fans feel about this now?
I don't know how they should feel about this, but I could definitely report on how they have reacted. Before COVID, before the theaters in California were closed down, the last time I had been at a public screening of any Lord of the Rings film, a revival, whenever Weinstein's name came up in the credits, there were noticeable boos and hisses from people in the audience just at the presence of his name. And then when the other names came up right after, including Fran, Peter, Philippa, cheers and applause. So there are vocal fans out there who are definitely not afraid to let their opinions out on this. But going forward, how we should respond to it is, I mean, obviously we need to acknowledge that this is the person who had a specific role, and out of many, many gears and many cogs in the whole mechanism, it's not to, he should not be aggrandized at all. He was just one of many. If you want to give someone else the lion's share of the credit, you should definitely look at Mark Ordesky and Ken Kamins. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it wouldn't have happened without Ken and Mark and their enthusiasm right the way along. It was absolutely vital. I think, Harvey's legacy is kind of twofold. You're absolutely right. It wouldn't have happened without him. He was that bit of fate at the time who could get the rights out of Saul's Ants. Yeah, who knows? Maybe they could have chipped away at Saul. Ken Kamins could have called him. Maybe. We don't know. And Harvey, has a legacy. He's a heinous man, and the story of him is awful. But it's the difficulty of reframing history and removing people from history. It's impossible to do. Harvey was a major, major filmmaker in his day, and he was a horrible, horrible person. But he did make a lot of Oscar-winning films, and he contributed to them, in whatever process he chose, dastardly as he was. And so we have to kind of come to terms with that. We have to recognize that happened. And it wasn't just Lord of the Rings, it was a lot of other films as well. I mean, Miramax were hugely successful. Would Quentin Tarantino be with us without Harvey? The filmmaker he is. And we have to come to terms with that. We have to come to terms when we watch Chinatown, and a marvelous film it is, that it was made by Roman Polanski. We have to kind of deal with that and try and separate the art from the circumstance. It's not easy to do. And I think to a small extent, we have to do it with Lord of the Rings. But in some ways, Harvey's also a villain in this story. He almost stopped Peter making the film he wanted to make out of his own pique and his own pride. And it's New Line sort of rescued him and came in and saved the day. Because without New Line, we've never got the 3 films. We've never got the trilogy as it stands. So Harvey is beneficial, and he almost destroyed it at the same time. So he's both good and bad in this story. But we have to accept he is part of the history.
Kristin, the Amazon's Lord of the Rings series already has 10 credited executive producers. And we're not even through the first episode yet, and they want this to be 5 seasons. I mean, there's going to be dozens and dozens of executive producers. I mean, just running the numbers, there will be troublesome people that, you know, it's Hollywood, right? You can't expect that everyone's going to be the greatest, you know, personal thing. So I guess I'm trying to find a way where we as fans can accept that there will be troublesome people, potentially be troublesome people, on the future of Middle Earth in the Second Age, but we can deal with that in a better way. I mean, can we not do we not ignore? We can't discount or ignore the role that everybody plays. But maybe Ian's right. We have to separate the art from the artist. Do you think?
Well, I think partly executive production sounds very, very grand, you know, the executive producer. But it's really, you know, maybe somebody who finessed a little bit of the financing along the way, or as in this case, got the rights. You could be an executive producer fairly easily. It's people like Barry Osborne, who was down there all, you know, the entire time, that he really produced that film. And Mark Rodesky produced it by overseeing this communication between New Line and the people in New Zealand. But I don't think people understand that. They think somehow these people are being glorified for having done something major. And yeah, inevitably some, you know, less than admirable people are going to be given credit, but you can't erase history, is my opinion. I mean, I'm a historian. I know that if you ignore these things, they don't go away. And if people are, you know, this is a trigger for somebody, then they should close their eyes and they should, you know, not pay attention. But you know, it is what it is, as they say.
And I think I would hope that the current people working in Hollywood, working on Lord of the Rings, working with Amazon have, you know, take notes from the past and, you know, are building a better world, building a better Tolkien production, being true to Tolkien, and you know, all of these lawsuits, all of these contracts. There's so much public record about, you know, the legal ramifications of all 6 Middle-earth movies, that has to come into play, and you know, the people in charge are aware of it, should be aware of it, and hopefully will do better and recognize that, you know, if there is some bad behavior going on, or, you know, there's something weird happening, that they can nip that quickly, you know. And I think, based on what I heard today, I mean, Cliff, it sounds like one of the best decisions ever made was to buy Harvey out and just tell him to go away.
Indeed. I would not be averse to having new language in future contracts. And I mean punitive language. Why not have future contracts for executive producers who are not involved in the creative, who are not involved in the day-to-day functions with boots on the ground, getting something made? Why not have punitive language in a contract that says, if you are, you know, caught or arrested or do X, Y, and Z things that are damaging to the reputation of the film, the project itself, then you can have your name removed from future streaming platforms, future home video releases. I would not mind having punitive language like that in contracts. That's just one man's opinion over here.
Kristin, final question. Do you think Harvey's reputation impacted Tolkien's legacy?
No, not at all. I think people recognize that Harvey ultimately had relatively little to do. He had one important role to play, but the film we see really has no reflection of his participation.
Ian, same question. I mean, like obviously there were impacts during production of excluding actresses and huge buyouts and stuff. Do you think Harvey Weinstein has a legacy with Tolkien, or it's moot at this point?
If he has any legacy, it's the man who threw it away. It's the man who lost it. It's the man who had the golden ticket. He may not have known it. He had a 3-film, $4 billion plus multi-Oscar winning franchise sitting in his lap, and he squandered it with pride. He could have got Eisner to back him up. He could have gone down the line. And we should only be delighted by that, because 3 films were made, and as we all know, that they're wonderful, wonderful adaptations of the books. And they were made, they were tough to make, but they were made with great joy and a great deal of enthusiasm and free of the terrible things that happen with many Harvey productions. So we should be thankful for history and the way it's turned out. Harvey, he got it wrong. You know, he got it badly wrong. And Bob Shea and Mark Ordesky got it right. But ultimately, Peter, Fran, and Philippa got it right. They knew how to turn those words into those pictures. And that's what we're left with.
Well said. Very well said.
Ian's book is called Anything You Can Imagine, Peter Jackson and the Making of Middle-earth. It is probably the definitive, almost a biographical play-by-play of how the entire Middle-earth franchise came to be. And Kristin Thompson's The FRODO Franchise is a nuts and bolts look at the numbers behind the franchise and what it takes to what it took to put it together and you know the success of it. So if we just covered some of the topics that are involved in the book in both of these books, but if you guys want to learn more about the real nuts and bolts of like how these things came together, how they pulled it off, and then how they kept it together in the wake of success, both of these books are well worth ordering right now, and you can get them on Amazon and most bookstores, I think, right? Is there a way? Is there
and
a
you can get them at your independent, get them at your independent small bookstore in your neighborhood.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, is there a bookstore that you guys like to support?
I don't think my book is in bookstores anymore. Being 13 years
Second
old.
printing, third printing, fourth printing.
I wish.
He said it's going to happen.
If I can add one thing, I did write for the Wiley Blackwell companion to J.R.R. Tolkien. I wrote the essay on film and television adaptations. So there's much more about the original contracts, about the original attempts to make films from the books. And it also talks about some of the more obscure and foreign adaptations that were made. So there's that.
Fascinating.
And
well,
Ian, what's your next project? Are you going to do the same treatment to Amazon?
No, I'm very much looking forward to seeing the Amazon series. I'm a bit curious. I don't really know what it's going to be. Like most of us, I'm trying to assemble it in my head. I'm going to be really happy, rather like Peter, just to sit back and watch it. I worked very hard on Lord of the Rings, and Peter was very good to me, and I did our magazine stuff, and I wrote my book, and I pulled those films to pieces so many times. It's quite hard to watch them just and know what's going to happen with them. So I'm just going to be a punter. I'm just going to be a guy who's going to turn up and watch these Amazon things and see what they make of it. I'm slightly skeptical but enthusiastic.
That's awesome.
Me too.
I think we all are. Cliff, gosh, those are all the questions I have. I think this was very informative. I learned so much, even beyond the page, with this conversation today of how things actually went down, and it touched on like 10 different franchises.
Did indeed. Thank you both very much for coming to join us today. Your erudition, both of you, it's remarkable books, and it's really great to have had you, Kristin, with our family at the One Ring for so long, and now you, Ian, welcome to our family, and welcome to our ever-growing, ever-expanding community. We're eager to see what the next turn of events are. We're, hopefully trepidatious, or we're maybe just holding it together. We're hoping for the best, and we're going to see what happens. Before I say goodbye to the audience, if you take a look at any of the old merchandise, and there's a lot of Lord of the Rings merchandise. There's toys, playing cards, action figures, Trivial Pursuit, and there's even Burger King, glass goblets, whatever. Look at the bottom. Look at the trademark and the notice on the bottom of anything, even the little individual collectible card games. It all says Saul Zentz, doing business as DBA, Saul Zentz Enterprises, and they're always listed. They're always listed there, even in the most unexpected places, doing business as Middle Earth Enterprises. In the future, all of our toys, games, and video games, and all the other merchandise most likely will not even say that anymore because the terms are all different. So it's like the end of an era. Even if you see the letters SZE printed in a copyright on the bottom of your plastic figure, you know that that's original era Saul Zentz copyright thing. But it's all going to change now. It's going to be really interesting.
And Harvey Weinstein is the end of an era and the end of an error.
Yes, and the end of an era. You're so good. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us again. My acknowledgement to our guests, and thank you, Justin, for putting it all together for us behind the scenes, and to our very faithful audience who comes to join us live every Tuesday. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you all again on theonering.net next Tuesday for another edition of our 5 p.m. show. You can follow us on social media, The One Ring Net, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Twitch, and all those other places. Me, I am QuickBeam2000. You can find me as well. So thank you very much. Ian, Kristin, Justin, do take good care of yourselves. Until next time, good night and good luck, or as I like to say, buenos noches y buena suerte. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.